Marry me or lose the land by first snow. Cyrus Pruitt said it the way a man might comment on the weather, folding the foreclosure notice back into his breast pocket, as though he hadn't just upended Naomi Shaw's whole life on her own front porch. She had not asked him to say it. She had asked him 3 times now for another season to pay down the note her husband had left behind when the fever took him, and 3 times Pruitt had refused until this morning, when he'd arrived with the bank's paper in one hand and, apparently, a proposal of his own in the other, not out of any tenderness. She understood at once, but because he wanted her spring-fed acres more than he wanted the debt repaid, and marrying her was simply the cheapest way to take both. "I'd rather freeze," Naomi said, and meant it. "You've got 2 boys who might feel different." Pruitt's eyes slid past her to where Caleb, 12, stood in the doorway with his younger brother Jonah pressed close behind him. Both boys silent and watchful in the way children got when they'd learned that grown-up conversations decided their whole futures. "Think on it. I'll be back before the frost fair for your answer, one way or another." He rode off unhurried, certain of his leverage, and Naomi stood on the porch shaking with a fury that had nowhere useful to go. She went inside and found Caleb setting the table without being asked, the way he'd taken to doing since his father died, as the boy of 12 could hold a household together through sheer diligence alone. Jonah sat by the cold hearth turning a wooden horse over and over in his small hands, not looking at her, and Naomi understood that both her sons had heard every word Pruitt said from the doorway, and were doing their level best not to show her how frightened they were, for her sake as much as their own. "We're not losing this place," she told them, with more conviction than she felt. "Your father built this house. It's not going to some banker who never lifted a shovel on it." Caleb nodded, trusting her the way boys trusted mothers who had never yet let them down, and Naomi went to bed that night with the note's deadline circling her thoughts like a wolf that hadn't decided yet whether to attack. Word of Pruitt's ultimatum reached Abel Hartley by supper, carried by a ranch hand who'd overheard it at the mercantile and thought the rancher ought to know, given that Abel's spread bordered the Shaw widow's land on its north fence, and given that Abel himself had spent the better part of 2 years fighting off the same bank's patience running thin. 2 seasons of drought had gutted his herd count below what the note required, and he'd been circling the same grim arithmetic for weeks. Not enough grass, not enough water, not enough time. He rode to her place the next morning, not entirely sure what he meant to say when he got there, only that the thought of Pruitt getting his hands on that spring, the one good water source between their 2 failing claims, had kept him awake half the night for reasons that had less to do with his own ledger than he wanted to admit. Naomi met him at the fence line with a rifle she wasn't quite pointing at him, and a look that dared him to try his own version of Pruitt's offer. "I'm not here to buy your land," Abel said, before she could order him off. "I'm here because I've got the same bank breathing down my neck, and I've got an idea that doesn't involve either one of us losing everything to a man who never worked a day of it." She lowered the rifle, if not her guard. "I'm listening. Your spring waters both our places if the fence between them came down. My herd's short what the note requires, but it's healthy stock, good bulls, better than anything Pruitt's counting on taking off you cheap. Separately, we're both finished by first snow. Together." He stopped, aware of how the words that came next would sound, and said them anyway because there wasn't a gentler way through it. "Together, married, our claims combine into one holding that clears both debts outright. I'm not asking for anything you're not offering freely. Your boys keep this house. I keep my herd, and Pruitt gets nothing." Naomi studied him a long moment, a broad, sun-weathered man with tired eyes and dirt still under his nails from a morning's work he hadn't stopped for, offering not rescue exactly, but partnership, which was a different thing entirely and, she found, harder to refuse. "You're not doing this for love," she said. "No," Abel agreed. "I'm doing it because I'd rather share a hard winter with someone honest than lose everything to someone who isn't. What comes after that I couldn't tell you, but I'd treat you and those boys fair. That's the only promise I've got to give right now." It was, Naomi thought, a better promise than most men's declarations of love. She thought of Caleb and Jonah, of the home their father had built with his own 2 hands, of the alternative, Pruitt's cold, calculating eyes assessing her like another asset to be acquired. "All right," she said. "For the boys, not for anything else." "Understood," Abel said, and if something flickered in his face at her insistence on the terms, he didn't let it show for long. She asked him, before he rode off, why a man in his own straits would trouble himself over a widow's fence line at all, when he might have let Pruitt take the shore place and simply bought the war rights off the bank later, cheaper, once she and her boys were gone. Abel considered the question a long moment, as though he hadn't fully worked out the answer himself. "'Cause I watched my own place go quiet after I buried my wife and my boy," he said finally, "and I've had 9 years of quiet to know I don't want any more of it. Pruitt getting your land wouldn't have saved mine anyhow, not really. But even if it would have, I don't believe I could have lived with myself, watching 2 boys turned out of the only home they've known, so a man like that could add another acre to his ledger. Call it selfish or call it decent. Both are true enough." That answer settled something in Naomi that Pruitt's threats never could have. She did not tell Abel so. She simply nodded and went home to tell her sons that they would not, after all, be losing their father's house. They married within the week, a plain ceremony held in the front room of Abel's house, witnessed by a handful of neighbors and the circuit preacher who rode through twice a year, conducted with the brisk efficiency of 2 people signing a contract rather than pledging a romance. Naomi wore her one good dress, grey wool with a collar she'd mended twice, and Abel wore a coat that didn't quite fit across shoulders that had broadened since he'd last needed it for a funeral rather than a wedding. Neither of them pretended, for the neighbors' benefit or their own, that this was a match born of courtship. They said their vows plainly, signed the county paper Abel had drawn up specifying the terms of the land's combination, and shook hands afterward like business partners rather than newlyweds. While Caleb and Jonah watched from the doorway with the cautious hope of boys who understood, without being told outright, that something important had just been decided in their favor, Naomi moved her small household the half-mile to Abel's larger, better-built house that same afternoon. The boys' belongings loaded into the very wagon Pruitt once eyed as collateral, and stood a long moment on the porch of a house that was not the one her first husband had built, feeling the strangeness of it settle over her like a coat that hadn't yet been broken in. The first weeks were awkward in the particular way of 2 proud, grieving, careful people learning to share a roof without either quite trusting the arrangement to hold. Abel kept to the barn most evenings longer than the work required. Naomi kept her half of the house so scrupulously separate it might as well have had a line drawn down the middle, but the boys did not observe such careful distances. Jonah, 7 and fearless, attached himself to Abel within days, trailing him on chores and peppering him with questions about cattle and horses that Abel, to his own quiet surprise, found himself enjoying answering. Caleb, older and warier, took longer, but even he began drifting toward the corral in the evenings, watching Abel work with the kind of attention boys paid to men they were deciding whether to trust. It was Jonah, in the end, who cracked the careful distance between the grown-ups. He fell from the hayloft one afternoon, not far, but far enough to knock the wind from him and send Naomi running from the garden white-faced with terror. And Abel reached the boy first, gathering him up with hands that shook only after he'd confirmed nothing was broken. Murmuring low reassurances Naomi had never once heard him use on the cattle he tended with such care, she arrived to find her son cradled against a man's chest, as though he were something precious beyond price, and something in her own good heart gave way at the sight of it. "You were frightened," she said that night, after Jonah was tucked in and pronounced merely bruised. "Wasn't going to let anything happen to him," Abel said simply, and the plainness of it undid her more than any flowery declaration could have. After that, the walls between them thinned by degrees. Abel began seeking her out in the evenings instead of avoiding her, telling her about the ranch's history, his own losses, the wife and infant he'd buried 9 years back and never spoken of to another living soul. Naomi found herself waiting for those evening conversations the way she'd once waited for her first husband's letters during a courtship she'd thought she'd never feel the like of again. She caught herself more than once watching Abel across the supper table and feeling something that had nothing to do with contracts or convenience at all. Pruitt did not accept his defeat gracefully. He arrived at the combined ranch 3 weeks before the note's deadline with 2 hired men and a fresh set of papers, claiming a surveying error had misdrawn the boundary between the properties, that the spring in question sat by his newly commissioned map, entirely on land still legally his to claim through a lien he'd bought up quietly on a corner of Abel's original acreage. It was a thin lie dressed up as law, but thin lies backed by hired guns had teeth enough to matter on the frontier, and Pruitt meant to press his claim before the marriage's water rights could be recorded at the county seat. Abel had ridden to the county seat himself to check the record books the moment he heard of Pruitt's supposed survey, and had returned grim-faced, confirming what Naomi already suspected. There was no error, no lien, nothing but a forged map and a banker's desperate gamble that no one would trouble to check his lie before the note's deadline made it moot. But knowing a thing was false and stopping a man willing to enforce it with hired guns were two different problems entirely. Annabelle had spent the evening pacing the porch, rifle within reach, waiting for trouble he was certain was coming. That night, under a hard white moon, Pruitt's men rode for the spring, meaning to dam it and drive off what cattle grazed nearest, hoping to gut the herd count below the bank's requirement before anyone could stop them and force the whole arrangement to collapse. Caleb, sleepless and worried in the way boys got when they sensed trouble in the air, spotted the riders' torches from his window and roused the house. Abel was in the saddle before Naomi had finished pulling on her boots, and she was not far behind him, rifle in hand, the same rifle she'd once nearly leveled at him across a fence line, now aimed at men trying to steal her son's future out from under them. They reached the spring to find Pruitt's men already working at the earthworks meant to choke the water off, and what followed was less a gunfight than a standoff of nerve. Abel's voice like iron in the dark, ordering them off land that belonged by marriage and by law to him and his wife both. Naomi's rifle steady in hands that did not shake, though her heart hammered fit to burst, and behind them both, unexpectedly, half a dozen neighboring ranchers who'd caught wind of Pruitt's scheme and ridden out unasked to stand witness against a man who'd tried the same trick on most of them at one time or another. "You're trespassing on recorded land, Pruitt," Abel called across the dark water, his voice carrying flat and hard over the sound of the spring. "Every man here can testify to it, and every man here knows exactly what your survey's worth." Pruitt, mounted at the rear of his hired men where the danger was thinnest, tried bluster first. "That map's filed with Territorial Office. You'll be the trespasser once the court sorts sort at Hartley, and I'll have this spring and both your places besides for the trouble." "Filed with an office you bought a clerk in," came a voice from the dark, and old Deacon Fry rode forward into the torchlight, flanked by 4 more ranchers who'd saddled up the moment word reached them that Pruitt meant to make his move under cover of night. "I sat on the Territorial Survey Board 11 years, Cyrus. I know a forged plat when I see one, and so will the judge in Cross Timbers when I bring it to him myself. Forged surveys are a hanging matter in some territories. Here, they're just going to be the end of you." Pruitt's hired men, faced with a dozen armed and furious homesteaders instead of one frightened widow, decided the wages weren't worth the risk and rode off into the dark without waiting to be told twice. Pruitt himself, cornered and exposed before witnesses enough to end his credibility in the county for good, blustered a while longer about lawyers and liens, his voice climbing thin and desperate in a way that told Naomi more plainly than any confession that he knew he'd already lost. Deacon Fry simply sat his horse and waited him out unmoved until Pruitt's bluster ran dry and he wheeled his mount and rode off into the dark and did not return. They stood at the spring afterward in the settling quiet, adrenaline draining slow out of both of them, and Abel turned to find Naomi watching him with an expression that had nothing guarded left in it at all. "You came out here in your night clothes with a rifle to defend my water rights," he said, something wondering in his voice. "Our water rights," she corrected. "Our land. Our boys." She paused, and when she spoke again her voice had gone soft in a way it hadn't been since long before Pruitt's first visit. "I told you I married you for the boys, Abel. That was true once. It isn't the whole truth anymore." "No," he agreed, closing the distance between them under the wide moon-washed sky. "It isn't for me either." He kissed her there at the spring that had nearly cost them everything, gently, like a promise finally spoken plain after weeks of careful silence. And Naomi kissed him back with the certainty of a woman who had married for shelter and found, against every careful expectation, a home built on something far sturdier than convenience. The note was paid in full at the Frost Fair, the deed recorded clean under both their names. And the following spring, watching her boys race Abel to the newly mended fence line with a laughter that hadn't lived in that house since her first husband died, Naomi understood that she had not simply saved her son's inheritance. She had built them and herself an entirely unlooked-for second chance at a life worth keeping.